So here we are in chapter 5, and chapter 5 deals with the concept of energy. So our chapter is energy and life. So you should remember from chapter 1, when we introduced biology, that one of the important characteristics of life, of living things, is that they require energy. We require energy to grow, to reproduce, to move. We require energy in our cells, fundamentally, to build things, to move things like a vesicle, make molecules. So energy is critical and crucial to life. So this introductory slide is trying to represent or show you energy in the sense that there's some mushrooms glowing in the dark. Well, the light that is being emitted from those mushrooms is a form of energy. And of course, the only way those mushrooms can be doing that is if they have access to energy in their cells to release that light. Fascinating stuff. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a firefly or a lightning bug, lightning beetle. And there's a forest that's got lightning beetles flying around illuminating. So they also are able to release light, a form of energy. But the only way they can do that is by releasing energy from chemical reactions in their cells. And then that energy can come out of their body as light. They can talk to each other and communicate. So it's just a visually captivating way to express the concept of energy, to show you these organisms that are releasing light. So remember, our cells are like chemical factories. We just finished chapter 4, where you learned about the parts of cells, the organelles, what they do, and so on. And so this chapter is adding on to that, helping you understand how cells use energy for a variety of things. And our cells are always using energy, nonstop, to stay alive. Different jobs, moving, growing, displaying, reproducing. So let's jump into this chapter and let's continue with our slides and learn some more details about energy and life. So let's start off with the definition of energy that you should know. Energy is the capacity to cause change or to rearrange a collection of matter. Kind of a strange concept. Can't look at energy, can't visualize it through a microscope or something. It exists as one of the physical things in our universe. Capacity to cause change or rearrange a collection of matter. So there's two different forms that energy comes in. Kinetic energy, which is the energy of movement, and potential energy, which is resting energy. It's not doing anything. So let's first briefly look at kinetic energy. Energy of motion. An object is moving. An object is changing location. So you're at a pool table and you hit the billiard balls and they go bouncing and colliding off of each other and off of the sides of the table. That's kinetic energy. As you're walking across campus or a parking lot, that's kinetic energy. Of course, I'm here talking to you and I'm moving my mouth, I'm moving my eyes, I'm moving my hands about. That's all kinetic energy. So if you think about it, you could probably identify many examples of kinetic energy. Even heat is thermal energy, or random movement of molecules as they're bumping and colliding into each other. Well, how about potential energy? That's resting energy. The energy is not being used to do anything. And that can be due to location, like where an object is, or it could be due to chemical energy. So energy found in a molecule. It has nothing to do with where the molecule is. Could be on a floor, it could be up on a shelf. Doesn't matter the location. So potential energy due to location. Think about any kind of object on the top of a hill, a ball, a boulder, whatever, that might roll down. And when it rolls down, it's releasing energy. That's kinetic. But while it's resting on the top because of its location, that's potential. When it comes to molecules, electrons have potential energy due to the location that they're in around a nucleus. And during a chemical reaction, electrons are changing location and they're releasing energy, or absorbing energy for that matter. So there's also potential energy in molecules, and that's what we use. That's what living things mostly use, is definitely humans, definitely animals, is energy that is resting, energy that is stored in the chemical bonds, the covalent bonds of molecules. So don't forget that, because that's a critical point that's going to come up again in this chapter and in chapter 7 on cellular respiration. The energy that we use to do things in our cells and to build our bodies, maintain our bodies, to grow, to develop, that energy is in molecules due to the location of electrons around a nucleus. Now let's finish this slide up by taking a look at the figure down on the bottom corner, because it's showing you people, swimming in a lake, and the person up on the platform is representing potential energy. They're standing due to location. The person who's jumped off the platform and is falling through the air, well, that's kinetic energy, energy of movement. The people that are down floating in the water or treading water, they have less potential energy than the person up on the platform, again, due to their location. And the person who's climbing up the ladder to get up to the platform, well, they're converting stored or potential energy in their muscle, and they're converting that to kinetic energy as their muscles are moving and contracting and getting them up on top of the platform. So think about and look at that figure, and to help you grasp the concept of energy and the different forms it comes in, kinetic and potential. Now the next thing we're going to do is take a look at a couple laws of thermodynamics in the realm of physics. Because we exist at the mercy, if you will, of these laws of thermodynamics. They are properties of the universe. Now, what is thermodynamics? Thermo, that should make you think of heat, dynamics, things moving, dynamics. So thermodynamics is the study of energy transformations, including heat that occurs in matter, okay, some kind of system, a body, an engine, something like that. So now we can have an isolated or closed system, and though an isolated or closed system is unable to exchange matter or energy with its surroundings, whereas an open system can exchange matter and energy with its surroundings. So we are organisms, just like the brown bear on the slide. So organisms are what? Open or closed systems. Do we exchange matter and energy with our surroundings? We absolutely do. So we are open systems. As a matter of fact, there are no truly closed systems in our universe, because energy and matter can be exchanged throughout. Anyway, the first law of thermodynamics is also called the law of conservation of energy. So you should know it by both names. And what this law says, what we mean by it being a law, is that no matter where we go in our universe, we can expect this to be true. That's, in a sense, what we mean by laws in science. Things that are true everywhere in our universe, throughout all of time in our universe. So the first law is that energy can be transferred or transformed. It can be moved around, but it can't be created or destroyed. So the amount of energy that exists in our universe is a constant. It's not becoming more, it's not becoming less, it's staying the same, but the energy can move around. Energy can come from the sun. It can be captured by things here on Earth. It can dissipate out from our planet into space. So it can move around, but it can't be created and it can't be destroyed. So what consequences does this law have to life, to organisms? Well, living things cannot create energy. You can't make energy. I can't make energy. A plant can't make energy. Nor is energy destroyed when we use it to move or grow or develop. It's just moving around, transferring around. Living things, organisms, can only get the energy they need from an outside source because we can't create it. And where do we get our energy from? We've touched on this since chapter 1. The sun, our star. And even that one day will burn out, but not for a couple billion years. Now here's the second law of thermodynamics, and it is often called the law of entropy. Entropy. I'm going to tell you what entropy is. I see I don't have it on this slide, but entropy is a measure of how disordered the energy is in a system. By the way, heat is the most disordered form of energy because molecules are just randomly bumping around, spreading out, and that's very disordered energy. So the second law of thermodynamics, law of entropy, says that energy cannot be converted from one form to another without some of that energy being lost as heat into the environment. So you have chemical energy in the food that you eat, maybe a sausage McMuffin with egg, maybe a smoothie, maybe a banana. And that chemical energy in your food is used to make ATP, something you're going to learn about later in this chapter. And that ATP energy is used to make muscles move. So along the way, every time energy is being converted from energy in your food to ATP in your cells, ATP in your cells being used, the energy being used to make your muscles move, every time the energy is being converted and transformed, some of the energy is lost to the environment as heat. And that energy that's lost as heat can't be used to do any work. It's just randomly dissipating energy. It's just the way it goes. Think about when you're exercising. Of course, your muscles require a lot of energy to do all that movement. When you're running or bicycling or whatever. And you get hot. Energy is being released from the molecules in your body, make your muscles move. And as this law is saying, some of the energy is released as heat. And the more you exercise, the more you're using energy in your body, the more heat that's released. You got to get rid of it. Your body's got to get rid of it. So there is the second law of thermodynamics in action when you're exercising. So, as I mentioned, entropy, I do mention it here on the slide, is the amount of disordered or random energy. And it's constantly increasing in our universe. So entropy, random energy, is constantly increasing. The figure to the right, take a look at that. We've got a bear that's running through the water. So it's contracting its muscles and it's moving. But as it's doing that, some of that energy from the molecules in its cells is being released as heat. Can't help it. So you got to replace that energy and eat more food. The figure on the bottom is showing how all of our energy on planet Earth that living things use begins with the sun, begins with solar energy. And that light comes to our planet. Plants capture that energy, convert it into chemical energy through photosynthesis. And once that energy from the sun is captured through photosynthesis, then it can be used by living things. A person can come along and eat an apple off the tree or a piece of fruit, and that energy is being converted from the apple into energy that's in the cells of our body, etc. So along the way, because heat's being lost along the way, eventually all the energy that originally was captured by that plant is lost to the environment, and got to get more. Keeps coming from the sun. So that's the second law of thermodynamics. So let's take a look at two examples here of thermodynamics in action, whether it be burning gasoline in your car, the engine of your car to make your car move, or burning glucose, if you will, in your cells to make ATP so your cells can do cellular work, moving things, building things, etc. So as I mentioned earlier, electrons in chemical bonds contain potential energy. They contain resting energy. And that energy is released during a chemical reaction. And this energy that's released during the chemical reaction can be used to drive a car or to keep cells alive. So if you look over on the figure on the far left, we've got gasoline or we've got glucose. Either one of these is fuel. It's a chemical that contains energy that can do something. So when that gasoline is combined with oxygen and there's a chemical reaction and it combusts, energy is released from the gasoline molecule. And some of that energy can be used to drive the car. Okay, it's being converted. It's being converted from one form to another, from chemical energy in the gasoline to kinetic energy of the wheels turning. But again, because of the second law of thermodynamics, some of the energy is lost as heat. And you can see that in the diagram, going out into the environment. The chemical products that result from that combustion are carbon dioxide and water. And the same thing happens in our cells as what happens in the engine of your car. Glucose reacts with oxygen. It combusts, it reacts. Some of the energy that's released is used to make this little molecule called ATP. And ATP then is used, the energy in that is used to do all the work of a cell. Moving a vesicle, building a molecule, waving a flagellum, whatever. But again, because of the second law of thermodynamics, a considerable amount of that energy that's released from your food, from glucose, is lost as heat. So we have to replenish it, get more energy, eat more food, more light coming from the sun. And just like in a car, the chemical products from this combustion are carbon dioxide and water. So the overall point is nothing can escape the laws of physics. The combustion of gasoline in an engine, the combustion of glucose in cells is really not that much different. We are witnessing the first and the second laws of thermodynamics. Energy is not being created or destroyed, it's being converted from one form, in this case chemical energy, to other forms. In this case, kinetic energy, car moving, heat energy dissipating out, etc. And yes, whenever energy is converted, some of it's lost as heat, inevitably. Entropy is increasing, and that's the second law. Physics, we can't escape it. Now, we briefly looked at chemical reactions, I think back in chapter 2, just to highlight what a chemical reaction is. We start off with reactants, the beginning molecules. They interact with each other, atoms rearrange themselves, and you get products, the resulting molecules. So during chemical reactions, chemical bonds, whether they be covalent or ionic, chemical bonds between atoms are broken. And the atoms rearrange and new bonds form, creating new substances. That's what happens. The beginning substances, once again, are called reactants. And the newly formed substances at the end of the reaction are called products. Some chemical reactions go to completion. That means all the reactants turn into all the products, and there's no reactants left over. Most chemical reactions come to an equilibrium where there are forward and reverse reactions that are stable, and it doesn't go to completion. So that's most kinds of chemical reactions. And what happens either way is based on energetics, gets more detailed and complex in physics. We don't need to worry about that. But in our bodies, we have reactions that go to completion. Most chemical reactions are at an equilibrium. Here's some examples of chemical reactions at the bottom of the slide. You could have molecular nitrogen react with molecular hydrogen, and that turns into ammonia. There we go. Reactants, products. We could have an ion of sodium attracting to an ion of chloride, and we get sodium chloride. That's a reaction. And then the last two down here are a couple reactions we see in living things. The first one is showing you actually the summary equation for photosynthesis. Plants are taking water, and they're taking carbon dioxide, and they're recombining the atoms and making glucose, sugar, and releasing oxygen. The last reaction is what we do in our cells with that process called cellular respiration, where we take a molecule of glucose, stored energy in that glucose. It reacts with oxygen, and we release energy from that glucose, and we make ATP, chapter 7. And the products are water and carbon dioxide, which we exhale. So, chemical reactions, starting off with reactants, turns into products, and the extent to which that happens depends on the energetics of the equation, which we don't need to worry about too much here. Now, during a chemical reaction, the reaction could be exergonic or it could be endergonic. And that's what this slide is all about, understanding the difference between each of these. So it depends on energy changes. Chemical reactions are either exergonic, which literally means energy outward. These kinds of chemical reactions are releasing energy that can be used to do something useful. Exergonic. Endergonic literally means energy inward. And in this situation, chemical reaction is not releasing energy that can be used, but it's absorbing energy that can be used later. So get that down. Exergonic, releasing usable energy. Endergonic, storing usable energy. So see figure A over here on the side, the top one, that's kind of in an orangey red color. And you can imagine the reactants in this big, tall, orange rectangular bar are like gasoline that's in your engine, about ready to be combusted and burned. So there's lots of chemical energy, lots of energy in the gasoline, or in your food, in your cells. It's the same thing. And as the gasoline reacts with oxygen, or as your food, glucose, reacts with oxygen in your cells, energy is released. Usable energy that can be used to do work. And the resulting chemical products have less energy in them than the reactants do because energy is released. So that's exergonic. The bottom figure is showing you an endergonic reaction. So check it out on the left. The reactants have very little energy in them. And then energy is input into the molecules. It's and the chemical products that result at the end of the reaction have more energy in them, more energy in their chemical bonds than the reactants did. So anytime that happens, then we're dealing with an endergonic reaction. Both of these reactions are going on inside the cells of living things, and at this point, it's just important that you know what these terms are, exergonic and endergonic, know their definitions, and be able to look at a graph like this and interpret it and understand what it's showing you. Exergonic, usable energy is released. The chemical products have less energy than the reactants did. Endergonic, usable energy is absorbed, and the chemical products have more energy than the reactants did. So as a prelude to learning about enzymes and what enzymes do and how they're important for life, we're first going to touch on the concept of activation energy and catalysis. Now, every chemical reaction requires energy to destabilize the chemical bonds of the reactants, make them unstable, so that the bonds can break apart in the reactants, and then new chemicals, products form. And that energy that's required to destabilize the chemical reactants, that's called the activation energy. It's basically contorting and stretching the molecules, destabilizing their covalent bonds until the breaking point, when they then can turn into products. So once the activation energy is absorbed by reactants, usually as the result of heat, it makes the molecules collide more often, makes the molecules hit each other with more force. That could provide the activation energy. But once that energy is absorbed, then the reactants come to that unstable condition and called the transition state. It's called the transition state. It's right at that point where the chemical bonds are going to break in the reactants, and then they're going to reform and make products. So take a look at the upper figure, because what we're looking at here is, imagine you've got a chemical reactant, okay, like a sugar, and it's going to break apart, and that reactant's going to turn into the products, like two smaller sugars. Well, in order for that larger sugar to break apart and undergo a chemical reaction, it's got to absorb energy to destabilize its chemical bonds. And that energy that it needs to absorb to destabilize it is called the activation energy. It's got to get across that activation energy barrier. And if this reactant absorbs enough energy, it'll get to the transition state, which is the peak of the activation energy. And then poof, it'll turn into products. So now, if a chemical reaction is catalyzed, then what that means is there's some kind of chemical substance that lowers the activation energy. So it doesn't require as much energy to destabilize the chemical reactants. And that will make it more likely that a chemical reaction is going to occur if you can lower the activation energy, make it easier to get to the transition state. And the most common way that cells, that living things do that, lower the activation energy, is by using enzymes, those kinds of proteins that accelerate or increase chemical reactions. So I didn't mention the bottom figure, but let's take a look at that. It's kind of an extension of the top one. So again, we've got reactants on the left. They have to absorb enough energy to get to their transition state. So the nice thing about the bottom figure, it's showing these reactant molecules have kind of a wavy line between their the chemical bonds. So it's unstable. It's gotten to the transition state. E sub A, you see that little E sub A there on the figure? That means activation energy. So if those reactants get to that transition state by absorbing the activation energy, then boom, they will turn into chemical products. That activation energy can be lowered using a catalyst, like an enzyme. So we're going to dive into that and look at that in more detail coming up. The thing we're going to look at here in part 1 of chapter 5 is metabolism. What is metabolism? And breaking it down in a little more detail. So metabolism literally is the sum of all the chemical reactions occurring in a cell or in an entire organism. So we might talk about, for example, carbohydrate metabolism, being all the chemical reactions in our cells or in our bodies that have to do with breaking down or forming carbohydrates. Or we might talk about muscle metabolism, all the chemical reactions that are related to muscle activity. Or human metabolism, meaning all the chemical reactions in your entire body. Metabolism. Now, metabolism is comprised or made up of thousands of intersecting chemical reactions, series of chemical reactions, one after another. And these series of chemical reactions that happen one after another are called metabolic pathways. So a metabolic pathway literally is a series of linked chemical reactions where the products of one reaction become the reactants for the next reaction, and so on and so on. Take a look at the figure on the bottom. So you have a starting molecule, like molecule A. And, as we'll understand in part 2 a little bit better, there's an enzyme that helps to lower the activation energy, lower the amount of energy required for molecule A to turn into molecule B. There's an enzyme for about every chemical reaction in your cells of your body to make these reactions go faster. So anyway, A turns into B, then B is a reactant that turns into a product called C. But then that chemical product, C, now serves as a reactant to turn into D. So you have this whole chain reaction, chemical reactions, A to B, B to C, C to D. That is a metabolic pathway. And our metabolism is made up of a complex network of all these metabolic pathways for forming or breaking down sugars, forming or breaking down proteins, all kinds of stuff. In fact, metabolic pathways that break down complex molecules into simpler ones, those are called catabolic pathways. Catabolic, like catastrophe, breaking them down. And energy is released in catabolic pathways. This energy might be used to do work. So when starch breaks down into glucose, that's catabolic, because you have this big long starch molecule and it gets broken down into smaller glucose molecules. That's catabolic. When glucose is broken down into carbon dioxide and water as part of cellular respiration, that's catabolic. It's getting broken down into smaller pieces. Anabolic pathways build complex molecules from simpler ones, and they require energy to build them. So they're always endergonic, by the way. They require an input of energy. Anabolic reactions are endergonic, just borrowing that term from a couple slides back, and catabolic reactions are exergonic. They release energy. So an example of an anabolic reaction would be when amino acids are bonded together to make polypeptides, bigger molecules. That's anabolic, building something bigger. And many anabolic and catabolic reactions can be found in metabolic pathways. So this slide finishes up those that we're looking at in part 1 of this chapter. We have introduced what energy is, coming in the form of kinetic or potential. We have reviewed thermodynamics, the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Energy can't be created or destroyed, and heat energy is always released anytime there is a energy transformation. Thermodynamics. We looked at exergonic and endergonic reactions, those that release usable energy and those that absorb them. And we've looked at catalysis and activation energy, that chemical reactions need to reach a transition state. They need to absorb a certain amount of energy, the activation energy, to turn reactants into products. And it was mentioned that enzymes help to lower the activation energy, make it easier for the reactants to turn into products. And that's what we're going to look at next as we continue in part 2.